you for inviting me, and thank you for the very kind words you used to introduce me. Unfortunately, I can't speak German, so and I speak bad English, so you will apologize me for that. I'm going to use some slides to make my presentation hopefully more understandable, and I try to share my screen to see whether you can see them. Please let me know if you can see my okay, thank you, Rupert. Well, the general idea was to give a first introduction about myself, but Rupert's introduction was excellent, so there is no need for wasting more time on that. This is the general outline of my presentation today. First of all, I will stop on some definition, what I mean by philanthropy and what I mean by impacts. While the first term is relatively uncontroversial, the second one is not. So it will be necessary to make it clear what I mean when I talk about impact. Then the main issue of my talk would be, should foundations estimate the impact and what it means? And the answer would be, it greatly depends on the roles and the strategies they want to pursue. And if they want to be innovators, and they quite often pretend being, they should estimate impact. But estimating impact is a quite complex task, takes several steps and a certain rigor in methodology. And so foundations should be aware of these difficulties. And then a few final comments on momentum in impact measurement, given by some new discoveries, let's say, in the field of economics and statistics, and the question about could impact measurement be a mission for the future of foundation? Should anything be unclear, please do not hesitate to interrupt me so that we can make it more lively. It's a pity we can't see each other directly. That would be much better, but you know, this is the way we work now. First of all, definitions, as I mentioned. Of course, debate about philanthropy is as old as man. I don't want to talk about that with all the different sides in psychology or economics or sociology. Today, I will only focus on the grant-making foundation model, meaning I will only talk about organization for whom philanthropy is the main task, meaning organizations with an endowment and using income or sometimes the endowment itself to support some common good. I don't want to enter too much into the debate of what a common good is. Let's assume that each foundation knows what the common good is for its purposes. Even though we do have around the world several different models of grant-making foundations, I do believe that the core functioning of these institutions are quite similar all over the world. And so we can rely on something that we understand and we see working in different actually environments. Much more complicated, at least in my opinion, is talking about impact. Because impact has several different meanings according to those who speak about it. So today I would like to focus in particular on what is called as the counterfactual approach or the potential outcome approach in measuring better estimating impact. According to this approach, one can define the impact of one project, action, intervention, policy, whatever, as the change in the state of the world, let's call it this way, measured by the modification of an outcome variable, a change that happens because a specific action has been taken. And a change that would have not happened if the action had not been taken. Therefore, well, to give you an example, we make an intervention about, I don't know, people who are young students who are at risk of dropping out of school. We want to modify that event. We want to change to improve their chances of finishing school, and we make a personal training intervention trying to improve their knowledge of math or languages or whatever. This is our intervention. We measure the effectiveness of this intervention by the fact that students actually drop out or do not drop out. And when we talk about impact, we should measure what happens when the intervention is undertaken and what would have happened to the same students had they not been part of that intervention. So when we talk about impact, we talk about the link, the causal link existing between an action and a change in the world. We do have an impact if something changes because we made an intervention, not regardless of our intervention or independently of our intervention. What is the problem in impact measurement? Of course, we can always measure whether the world has changed when an action, a policy, an intervention, a project has been taken. We simply measure the different levels of what we call the outcome variable over time. We know whether people were unemployed before our intervention. We measure their employment level after the intervention, and so we can see whether the world changed. This is what we call the factual. But we cannot measure what would have happened to the world, or better, to our outcome variable, if the action had not been taken. Meaning, we do not know what would have happened to our unemployed people had they not been part of our project, to our students at risk of dropping out of school had they not been involved in our intervention. So we can measure the factual, what actually works, what actually happens in the world, but we generally cannot measure the counterfactual. The counterfactual is always a hypothetical state of the world. It's something we do not see because nobody of us can live a double life. Given that we cannot measure the counterfactual, rigorously speaking, we cannot measure impact, being impact the difference between factual and counterfactual. So impact cannot be measured. Nonetheless, there is no reason for pessimism because over the last, let's say 50, but more, particularly 30 years, what I call a new science, the science of causal inference, has developed several methods that enable nowadays to estimate impacts, not measuring them. Remember, we cannot measure because when we make that difference, factual minus counterfactual, one of the two terms cannot be measured. So we have to make an estimate of it. This inference, this estimate of the counterfactual can be taken when and only when actions involve several persons or several units. We cannot reasonably estimate counterfactuals when we talk about a specific individual. What would have happened to Gian Paolo Barbetta had not been involved in the seminar, in this seminar tonight? Nobody knows. I could have gone somewhere else, but anyone could have his own guess about what would have happened, but nobody can say for sure. When we do plan to estimate impact for large groups of persons or units, we do have a way to get around this problem of not being able to measure the counterfactual, and we'll talk about that in a short while. Given that we cannot measure, rigorously speaking, impact on one single unit, I will not focus my speech on measuring the impact of Foundation X or Foundation Y. It's not very interesting, in my opinion, first of all. Second, this question cannot be rigorously answered. We don't know what would the world had been if Foundation X had not existed. So my question is different. The question is, should foundations invest their time, their money, their resources in general in estimating the impact of their actions, their programs, their projects, their initiatives, their grants on final recipients, being them individuals or the organization? Or they should rather save the money they devote to evaluation to increase the resources available to fund their own activities? My answer to this question is yes, they should. They should put their more money into evaluation, even though several complexities are involved, and estimating impact is not a simple task to undertake. What is the state of the art? In my knowledge, data are not as good as one would like to have when doing research. Few data are available, but the feeling is that most of the foundations world nowadays is busy discussing merits and disadvantages of impact evaluation, methods, timing, and so on. But actually only a small number of foundations estimate the impact of their actions systematically. This could be good or bad, depending on the answer you give to the question we asked a few seconds ago. Should foundation estimate impact? If they shouldn't, not bad if they don't. But if they should, then something is missing probably. Is this good or bad? It greatly depends, in my opinion, on a sort of strategic vision on what foundations are for, on the social role they want to play, and the specific activities that they can undertake to play that role. Here I will move to a very sketchy and imprecise description, and oversimplified, as I say, description of a model of foundation roles. It's very imprecise, given that, of course, there is no clear-cut distinction between the different roles I will mention in a second. And of course, quite many foundations play different roles, and the tools they use, the instruments they use to play this role are very different from each other. But generally speaking, and for the sake of simplicity, and trying to build a general model of foundation role, I would say foundation can play and generally play 4 different roles when we look at them outside there. The first role is the most ancient one, is the charitable role. They put their money and put their resources in general to try to soothe emergencies. They give money to individuals who became unemployment because of an economic recession. They try to help people who lost their houses because of an earthquake, and so on. They intervene in an emergency, putting money to serve and to help people surviving in a difficult situation. A different role is the advocating role, meaning that foundations do not provide directly any services or any good to people. They simply try to advocate public powers for some citizens' rights. They tend to to have the state more involved in defending immigrants or people with disabilities or whatever you think. Quite similar, quite often intertwined with the advocating role is the developmental role of foundation. In this case, foundation directly put their money into the provision of some sort of services in different fields, and the most common are, of course, the welfare, culture, education, or research fields, trying to fill gaps. Foundation know what is good, and it is as simple as that. There is not enough money to pursue the good for the whole population. Therefore, foundation fill in with their money a gap in resources. A quite different role is what I call the innovative role. When foundations act according to this role, they do not know what is good for the population. And this is a quite common situation. We quite often see that there are problems out there that we have not solved yet, and that we are not able to solve because we don't know what's the right policy, what's the right intervention that should be taken to address that kind of problem. We do have a feeling that something might work, but we're not sure about the final effect of this kind of intervention. So a foundation playing the innovative role generally does some sort of experiment, tries new answers to cope with social problems that have not been solved yet and with unmet needs. If you agree that this sketchy distinction between different roles foundations could play is at least reasonable, I do believe that the same distinction could lead our reflection about impact, because I do believe that estimating impact is not crucial for foundations who decide to play the charitable, the advocating, or the developmental roles. In fact, this foundation, and we all actually already know what is good and what is needed to play these roles. We all know that when people lose their houses because of an earthquake, we need to help them reaching a shelter and not living outside when it's cold. And what is needed is generally more money. We also know what should be done to increase the amount of services given to young kids living in poverty. So there is no real need for measuring or estimating impact, because we know that what we can do is good or has the expected effect on the problems we want to address. On the contrary, I believe estimating impact of our action is crucial if we play the innovative role. We want to tackle social problems using some new techniques, some new tools, some new policies, and we set up social experiments, so to say, but we want to be sure that the experiment we have undertaken produced the change we were aimed for. We want to be sure that our social, cultural, and environmental innovation changed the world in the direction we were expecting. It's not a trivial question, because when we estimate impact rigorously, sometimes we find that I call them some self-styled good practices are in fact not as good as they promise to be. Some policies or some intervention, as it often happens with innovation, may prove ineffective. Some of them may even be harmful. We had a recent experience in Cariplo Foundation measuring the impact, estimating, I should say, the impact of an intervention aimed at increasing the knowledge of literature for Italian high school students using the social network. The general idea was young people in Italy don't read books anymore. They spend most of their time chatting on WhatsApp, Facebook, or whatever. Let's try to put the two together. Let's use social networks to teach literature to Italian students in high school. I will refer to this experiment later on, but the final result of our impact estimate was awful. The intervention, although good in principle, proved very harmful for individuals. And so it's not necessarily true that when we decide to innovate, to intervene in a new way to address some social policies, we are effective. Innovation is a risky business, as most firms know, and it's a risky business in the social welfare field as well. So in order to play the innovative role, foundations should estimate their impact. When we move to the structural characteristic of foundations, we can also see that because of these structural characteristics, being a foundation well endowed that do not need to ask for funds to anyone else, and being independent of owners, markets, and the ballot box, foundations have a comparative advantage in pursuing innovation. And consequently, they should estimate their impact when they pursue innovation. We need innovation in social policies, and we know that innovation is risky. When some innovative interventions do not deliver as promised, or even more, they prove harmful, politicians would risk their re-election. They would never want to say, I spent 2 billion euros in this new intervention and it didn't work. They will never say that. Public officials would risk their position, and non-profit and market entities will risk their income. So these social institutions, market firms, not-profit entities, public administration, do not have any advantages in pursuing innovation and estimating their impact, because they are scared. They might be scared of failures. Foundations, on the other side, risk less when undertaking the risky business of innovation. They can survive even if the innovation does not work. Their trustees remain over there. They don't depend on the ballot box. And so they should pursue innovation, and they should estimate impact, because this is socially efficient from my point of view. They are the social institution which is in the better place for undertaking innovation and estimating impact of their activities. Nonetheless, there is one risk that innovation run into when they undertake the innovation role and when they start estimating impact. They do not risk to going bust, but could they risk their reputation or their legitimacy? This could happen. Foundations are always starving at good news on them. So they want people to talk about them in positive way. If so, this could, what Helmut Anheier and Diane Leith called, could generate what they call the benign fallibility syndrome. So it's in the interest of both grantor and grantees to be economical with admission of less than desired outcomes. Foundation undertake some innovative programs, but they simply don't estimate their impact because they are scared of a possible failure, and they're scared that this failure could harm their reputation. Of course, this is a real and an important concern if foundations perceive themselves as problem solvers. If my aim was to reduce unemployment or to reduce the rate of students drop out or to solve the problem of people with disability, a failure in that field would mean not being able to pursue my mission. But if foundations are not problem solvers, but they are rather knowledge developers, meaning their main task would be to learn what works, what does not work in solving problems, then failures should not be considered as a possible attack to one's reputation. Failures are as good as successes if my task is to put knowledge at, to give a society a wider and more profound knowledge on what works and what doesn't. So foundation, that's my thesis, should perceive themselves and should act as knowledge developers that pursue innovative action to solve some unresolved social needs and estimate their impact in order to understand whether these solutions work or not. But estimating impact is a very difficult task, as it requires at least two main steps. I will go very quick here because for the sake of time, and we might have a different specific seminar on this issue of impact estimation. But what is very clear is that in order to estimate their impact, foundations should specify in a very clear way what's the problem they want to address. They should declare the change that they pursue, which indicators should change because of the action they take. If they do not make these particular steps, it would be almost impossible to understand whether they were successful or not. If I do not know where I'm headed to, it's quite difficult to say whether I reach my destination or not. After that, of course, they should, and foundation quite often declare fuzzy targets, let's say. They want to improve the world, or they want to increase social cohesion, but nobody knows what social cohesion is and how we should measure it. After that, they should define a strategy and a protocol of intervention to pursue the change, and they should undertake the actions aimed at solving the problem. But perhaps the most difficult task is determine the existence of a causal link between the interventions that have been deployed and the change observed in the state of the world, in the set of indicators we use to see whether we were successful in our intervention or not. What is critical here is that the causal link between our action and the change in the world cannot be measured, because a link is something that it's in our mind, is not something there in the world. It could be estimated, but it cannot be estimating, measuring simply the difference in the outcome variable before and after the intervention, or between those who took part in intervention and those who did not. And quite unfortunately, these are the most common ways that people often use, and also foundations use, to estimate their impact. These estimates of impact are biased. They do not give us an unbiased estimate of the effects of our activities, because they're based on two mostly and generally untested assumptions. The before and after the intervention estimate is based on the assumption that while we make our intervention, our policy, no covariates that might influence the results of our action change over time. But if something changes, we cannot disentangle the effect of our intervention from the changes in the covariates that are out there and influence our results. The second estimate, the comparison between those who took part in the intervention and those who did not, could be biased because treated and untreated individuals could have been dissimilar, could have been different in at first time. Therefore, we cannot say that the difference we see after our intervention depends on the intervention itself. It might be the legacy of some differences that were there before we decided to intervene. So we cannot rely on these simple heuristic methods to measure, to estimate, impacts. Foundations should be the lead, let's say, leaders in using what the science of causal inference made available over the last years. And I do believe that one of the best methods that can be used to produce impact estimate is the so-called randomized controlled trial method, but also other methods that are generally called quasi-experimental approaches are available. A sign of the changes that happened in this field are the quite recent Nobel Prizes given to two different groups of people that developed over the last years techniques and use the techniques of randomized controlled trial and quasi-experimental approaches to estimate impact in the field of social welfare and social services. A randomized controlled trial is very easy in principle. You have a population which might be interested by one intervention, and you simply randomize access to the intervention itself, meaning you turn a coin, and if head comes out, the person is included in the intervention group, and if tail comes out, the person goes into the control group. And the control group is the best available estimate of the counterfactual situation that we want to have. Is the best estimate of what would have happened to those who were in part of the intervention group had they not been involved in the intervention. Therefore, I wonder whether estimating impact of some innovative social intervention could really be the mission of innovative foundations in the future. I would say so, because foundations, as I mentioned, can take the risk of innovation, can fail without going bust, and because innovation needs rigorous evaluation. Therefore, that's my conclusion. Foundation should specialize in supporting systematic evaluation of private and public policies aimed at pursuing the public good, and they should produce knowledge, the evidence on what works and what does not work in addressing social problems crucial for social well-being. Of course, this is not all that is needed. Once we know that something works, we need to deploy and to extend the reach of the workable intervention to a larger population. And this is not an area where foundations have a specific comparative advantage. Their resources are relatively limited, are relatively small compared to those that the states or the markets could deploy. But this could, this specialization could start a sort of a virtuous policy cycle where foundation produce knowledge while the non-profit organization and public bodies scale up what works while refrain or abandon what does not. In this way, I guess, our societies could get both the advantage of virtuous experimentation and the advantage of larger reach of what works. This is all of my knowledge. Sorry for being so long. Rupert, I thought I could speak 30 minutes, but it took much longer. So,
well, thank you very, very much, Paolo. Just to reassure the others, this is by no means the limit of your knowledge. There's you have a great deal more, and it's been really fascinating listening to you. I've jotted down a few things, but I'd first of all like to give all of you the opportunity to comment, ask questions, ask for clarifications. I'll look at the chat room to see whether there's anything there. Yes, Siri Hummel says, could you elaborate RCT a bit more with an example for foundations, e.g. working for education?
Yes, I could. I was planning to go deeper into the experiment I was mentioning, but I didn't have time. As I mentioned during my speech, Fondazione Cariplo is trying to address some issues in the Italian system of education. One of these issues is students' willingness to read books. The general idea was, as I mentioned, people don't read books while they stay all their time on social networks, and the intervention using Twitter to increase knowledge of literature was aimed at solving the problem. In order to understand whether the intervention was effective, we devised a randomized controlled trial. The organization pursuing the intervention and implementing the intervention, which is called Twitteratura, I will give you the online references if you wish, enrolled about 70 schools all over the country in this experiment, and we randomly assigned these schools to a treatment or to a control group. School randomly assigned to the treatment group entered the intervention right away at the beginning of the new school year, while schools randomized to the control group were asked to wait for a few months before entering the program. Meanwhile, we developed a test to measure students' knowledge of Italian literature, in particular of one specific book, which was studied through the intervention, and we measured the knowledge of the individuals, of the students involved. It was about 1,500 students involved in the intervention, both the treatment and the control group, before and after the intervention was undertaken. So by simply measuring the knowledge level of the students involved in intervention after the intervention ended and comparing that knowledge level with the knowledge level of people in the control group, controlling for previous literacy knowledge, we were able to show that the intervention was actually detrimental. People going through the Twitteratura intervention learned less than people using the traditional way of reading and studying the book. So the basic principle of a randomized controlled trial is randomization. Given that we can measure the factual, what happens to people undergoing an intervention, but we cannot measure the counterfactual, we estimate the counterfactual using a control group. The outcome variable for the control group is the best estimate that we can have for the measure of the outcome variable for the intervention group had the intervention group not been treated. This is because of a statistical law, which is called law of large numbers, that make it sure that when we have a large population and we randomly extract out of this population two groups, the two groups are on average identical. And therefore, we could use the control group as a good estimate of the treatment group had the treatment group not undergone the treatment. I hope it was understandable at least.
Yeah, thank you. I have one more here in the chat, and then I'll get to the handout. The one in the chat is from Hans-Joachim Preuss, who says, outcomes of activities. How does one make sure that not only expected, planned, and positive outcomes are estimated, but negative collateral damages too?
Okay, yeah, very interesting question. Well, I do believe that in principle, there is a long literature in the field of randomized controlled trials and policy evaluation on this issue, that in principle, a foundation or whoever runs a policy should declare in advance what the aim of the intervention is. And so one should say, well, my aim is to increase knowledge of literature. My aim is to increase employment rate for people with disabilities and so on. In principle, once we decide to run an intervention, we do have in mind that the intervention could be beneficial on some sides and harmful on some other sides. Therefore, it would be wise, I believe, to declare both the outcome variables that we want to improve and the outcome variable that we are afraid of changing in the worst direction. And nonetheless, one should not increase too much the number of outcome variables measured, given that we always have results in probability. Once we measure a large amount of variables, the probability of finding one which goes in the expected direction becomes very high. So this is one of the reasons why I mentioned at the very beginning, foundations should be focused. They should declare what they want to change in a clear and measurable way, and they should stick to those measures. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Now I have three other interventions. First, two who want to speak up. Alexander Pusoltis was first. Your turn.
Thank you so much. This is a very, very interesting and also relevant one for me. I will look into the topic of impact for the Philanthropic Foundation starting from now on, and this is very helpful. I think one question I have is that I think I disagree, and I would like to challenge you on your statement that you think for the advocacy role of foundations, it's not so important, because I wonder, well, if you do advocacy and it has no effect, you should invest your resources differently as well, like just as a kind of counter statement. So why do you think it's not necessary for advocacy? And the second question is more, do you know any foundations who really see their role as kind of a meta level impact evaluation task, or really testing government policies, for example, like as a private charitable foundation? because I would really be interested in this, because I can imagine that randomized controlled trials, they quickly cost more than €1 million per kind of test. So I wonder who actually does this. In Germany, I'm not aware, but also internationally, I would be very interested in actors there in the field. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, very interesting question, both. You're right. You're right. It could be that when playing the advocacy role, one would like to measure whether he's effective or not, because he has, in principle, several different strategies that he could use to pursue its task. So yes, it's a good point. I think you're right on this issue. From the second question, I'm not aware of any European foundation that is undergoing that, pursuing that task, with the only exception probably of the Education Endowment Foundation in Britain, whose specific task is to test the effectiveness of education intervention with the randomized controlled trials. They've run more than 100 so far as I know right now, and they are also starting some meta-analysis in this field. There are some minor examples in the United States. Arnold Ventures, for example, is one of these, but I'm not aware of any foundation assuming producing evidence as its main task. Definitely not in Italy. Italian foundation want to have a good press in general, not nothing else.
That statement would go for Germany just as well. Yes, Karenina.
Yeah, I think I had the exact same question. Why would it not apply also to development and advocacy? Because evidently there are always a myriad of ways on how I could go about it, and it would be good to know if one pathway is more impactful. But I do like your concept of, you can't measure it, but you can get close, or you can have estimates, and in particular you can learn from an estimate and learn together with those who you work with. As for the question of Alexander, I think there are some foundations who have done things in this regard, but there are definitely a number of NGOs who've done it. Because obviously the Amnesty and Transparency and Greenpeace and all of these organizations who have been working on policy for years have actually developed quite sophisticated measurement methods, and in particular learning methods on how to improve and get better in their advocacy and developmental work. Okay.
This was, I think, a comment. Do you want to react immediately?
No, I think I agree with you. The NGOs world, in fact, is one of the first who started doing a systematical program evaluation and using randomized controlled trial in this area. So I agree with you on that.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the chat, there's a question from Lukas Dieterberger from Switzerland. A question on the term social impact. Through their funding, foundations are often more system maintaining than system changing. Of course, foundations are free to choose their own goals. Doesn't the discussion about the understanding of social change get a bit lost by asking mainly how strong the impact is?
Not sure I got it correctly. For sure, I do believe that quite many foundations around the world are now trying to change marginal or minor roles or minor problems out there. The feeling I have is that the discussion about the impact is more about having good press that is showing that they're doing something. And so the quest for a measure of a foundation impact is so widespread and so meaningless, in my opinion, that it covered the real question, meaning, do the things that the programs, the project that we run, change the state of life of individuals or not? Not sure, Lucas, whether I got what you meant, but the feeling is that we are more interested in showing that we are good than in testing whether we are or not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's another one from John McManus. I would be interested, he says, in your thoughts on the effective altruism movement. They have posited a more data-driven approach to measuring how much good any intervention is doing. Are they bringing anything new to questions of impact in the field of philanthropy?
I do think they are, but in my opinion, they are a minority in the sector of philanthropy, and I'm not sure whether they correctly assumed the new knowledge that came out of the world of statistics or economics or sociology in impact measurement. Quite often, some of the persons or foundations belonging to that movement were attracted by, let's say, unsound measures of impact and more prone to measuring the impact of specific institution, which is, as I said several times, quite meaningless, rather than understanding whether programs were effective or not. Mm-hmm. But to a certain extent, they're an improvement compared to we don't care about impact at all.
This leads straight into the next question from Siri. How to prevent wrong impact measurements from foundations, like overloading recipients with reporting?
Use a professional evaluator. Try and be held by someone who did that professionally, and involve evaluators since the very beginning of program planning before deployment. I do believe that evaluators could be, let's say, critical friends, someone who is involved in the process, but at the same time is detached from it, so that they can say what the risks are and what should be done and what should not be done. Quite often, evaluators tend to overload beneficiaries with data collection. This is because sometimes we don't make the effort strong enough to figure out what data is available out there. We had a couple of experiences in Italy with the Cariplo Foundation. The first one was a program aimed at increasing employability of people with disability, and we were involved in asking each beneficiary and non-beneficiary randomly extracted of the intervention to know whether they work or they did not. And then it came out that some data were available at the ministerial level that could be used without imposing any burden on beneficiaries. So I guess a good evaluator could help in this field as well.
Okay, so now at last we have Fineo speaking up. Fineo is, colleagues from Fineo are very strong on the sort of impact issue. And Linda Gugelfeld says, impact level of foundations. One could also say the impact an intervention has on the beneficiary is the impact of the NGO and not the one of Foundation XYZ, as there are more funders behind the NGO. So shouldn't the foundation rather also focus on strengthening the NGOs that they fund? Otherwise, I find interesting discussions on who is expert in the topic between foundations and NPOs.
Good question. The point is that I'm not much interested in knowing whose impact is that, whether the foundation or the NGOs or whatever. Those are, I would say, technical devices that the foundation could find. It could provide the program directly or could use someone else depending on its strategies. But what is really interesting in my point is the program effective, regardless of who is deploying the program? I don't want to accrue any result to one or other institution. I'm not interested in that. I do believe that debate about foundation, a specific foundation impact, is completely meaningless and misguiding to a certain extent. What I'm interested in is foundations should play a social role. They should do something that other institutions are not well equipped enough to make, while they are. Then if it doesn't work, is their fault or is the NGO's fault? I don't care, it simply doesn't work. So we have to find out something else. And finding that something didn't work is as good as finding that something worked. It's helpful for society because it will prevent putting resources, efforts into the wrong direction. So I'm not much interested in attributing responsibilities or merits to anyone. I'm much more interested in the social policy effect side of the question.
Okay, now there's Stephanie Koopman, and she says, wow. If the effect of an intervention is demonstrated by a positive outcome based on an RCT, this does not mean that this intervention is the best solution to a problem on the market. RCTs are usually very siloed to one intervention or a fixed package of interventions. Often other solutions to problems actually have a greater impact, which funders, if they focus only on science-based approaches, then miss. One could skip certain expensive studies when the people affected in the programs, the final beneficiaries, could often anticipate the outcome as well, if one would just ask them.
Well, this implies that we already know that some other intervention is good, is beneficial. So if we already know that something else works, why should estimate impact? If we are sure that something works and we can prove it, who cares of measuring impact? No problem, just go for that intervention that has been shown as a good one.
Michael Abeck-Sebrich.
Yeah, so Professor Barbetta, can you please, the last part of what you just said, can you say that to the foundation community several times? Because there are interventions that work and they have evidence and
absolutely
they can be replicated. So that's the one thing. The other thing I would like to, I actually, well, maybe it comes with the profession. I'm very interested in what works for a foundation and what has the impact in a foundation, especially since often modern foundation strategies don't depend on one intervention or one grant. So if a foundation develops a whole initiative on investigative journalism and how to fund investigative journalism, then for sure it is, I would ask myself, how can I figure out that symphony of interventions, and they may be grants, they may be a public affairs campaign, they may be also policy work, how that symphony also has an effect. And I see your point that definitely it's always the question also what would have happened if they would not be there. But for sure, I also ask myself, do the various instruments that they have to play strategy, what kind of an effect do they have?
It's a very key topic, actually. I guess someone else is sharing screen. I see myself in someone else's screen. I'm not saying that everything that is relevant can be, the impact of everything that is relevant could be estimated in this, using this task. I agree with you on that. I do believe that some strategies of intervention are not as focused on one specific target as the examples I was making, and I'm quite sure that those could not be the effect of those strategies could not be estimated using a randomized control trial or a quasi-experimental approach. And therefore, we should refer to the several different tools of qualitative evaluations that are available out there, and we should rely on theories and make a reasonable rationale for those interventions. I mean, rigorous estimation of impact does not free us from using our rational attitude and connecting events and constructing theories and talking to people and so on and so forth. What I'm quite tired of is wrong impact estimation methodologies sold as true impact of an institution. That's the point I was trying to make.
Mm-hmm. This, I think, is a good last word from your side. Indeed, I think what you've been telling us has been quite an eye-opener to people in the audience. So thank you very much, very, very much again for consenting to do this. You made one very unwise remark during your talk by saying at a special moment, this would have to be dealt with in another seminar. Dear Paolo,
I'm sorry.
We will take you up on that.
Okay, I would be happy to, maybe if you wish, give you some examples of the kind of interventions whose impact we try to estimate in the future.
We will continue this discussion with you and hope you will join us again for another session. As for the outcome of this session, I'm very happy to tell you all that NPOR, the journal of the Institute for Nonprofit Law at Bucerius Law School, has asked for the full paper to print it in English in the NPOR magazine. So, and Paolo has very kindly consented to supply it. So in due course, you will all get a printed or be able to get a printed version. Also, of course, the recording will be up on our website and on YouTube for you to digest it again. So with that, thank you very, very much. Thank you, Paolo.
Thanks to you and for the very nice questions and kind remarks you made. It was very interesting.
We will hopefully be in touch. Thank you all for joining us and see you soon, I hope. Yep.